Yeah, I think this might actually be working now. Which would be good. Of course, we should be giving people a bit of time to log in if it is working. We're on? Hey, so that's something at least. So, just in case there is anybody already listening, sorry about the momentary delay there. Trying to get this all set up has been remarkably stressful under the circumstances. We want to give people enough time to come in and join us. So I've been asked to do a happy dance, which I must confess, of all the many dances that I do, happy isn't really what I'm known for. So let me just let them know that I think the problem has been resolved. Has the problem been resolved? Yeah, okay. So it's been fixed. And with a suitable emoji. So I think I'll get started in approximately 2 minutes or so. How are my sound levels? Am I talking a bit too relaxed? We'll see. And you're following the comments? Perfect. There we go. Everybody seems to be reasonably happy with this. As surreal as this is as a setup, I guess the sudden dramatic transformation from this isn't going ahead to suddenly putting everything together at the last minute in a location where that's not necessarily easy to do suddenly and out of the blue. But we have managed to find another improvised studio space, one with less background interruptions, which is our difficulty here quite specifically. And I think we're about ready to start discussing this. I'll give it another minute just so we can make sure that everybody who wants to be in doesn't miss the beginning. And hopefully there will be time for questions afterwards, but ultimately what we're hoping for is for a longer term discussion and conversation to come out as a result of this. So if you don't have an opportunity to ask a direct question, don't feel worried by that at all. This, I'm hoping, will be a much longer dialogue between Larpers all across the world and across cultural backgrounds. So hopefully, if you don't get a chance to ask your question today, you will get a chance to ask it again and again and again if it is a question that needs asking and needs answering. So. Okay. There are slides, unsurprisingly. And the slides, because I do not have the software that would allow me to directly transmit these to you, the slides are available. A link will be provided. You can feel free to follow along with those as we talk. But ultimately, what we're going to be discussing here should be fairly straightforward at this stage. You can go back afterwards and look at the slides and decide what you think. For context, we had a lot of discussions. I'm going to begin now. Well, we had a lot of discussions about whether or not I was going to include this part earlier on today, and I think I've decided pretty much at the last minute that I'm going to. We are currently located approximately 10 feet away from the location that a 21-year-old A-level student from a local college, Andrew J. Paul, was stabbed to death by a gang of 15 people whose ages ranged from 12 to 21. In every way, Andrew J. Paul was a nerd, other than the fact that he grew up in my neighborhood and in my area. This is a reality for living around here. There are very real, practical barriers to engaging with cultural content that isn't made available to the more vulnerable members of society, to the poorer members of society. And so if every now and again you end up wondering why someone would travel to the other side of Europe to have this conversation, it's because I get to be an international LARPer and Andrew J. Paul doesn't. That's the bottom line. But this isn't going to be achieved by shouting at each other. It's going to be achieved by having hard conversations about what exactly are those barriers. What are the things that are stopping us from being able to engage with the content? I know over the years the tricks that I have had to perform in order to join the international LARP community on an equal basis. And as I've traveled around various LARP communities, I've noticed other people do similar things. And we don't all agree on what the right way to do this. There is no one size fits all solution to making sure that people from structurally poor backgrounds, there is no one size fits all solution that will allow all of us to engage with LARP of any variety. So what we can do is we can look at the individual facets, the different sides of structural poverty, how it impacts different people, and what kind of strategies would help different people, and what we are currently doing in order to attend LARP events. This is not intended as a definitive guide. This is not intended as an appeal from authority. This is intended as an observation and a starting point for a discussion. If everybody loudly disagrees with me but continues a dialogue that ultimately allows the access to LARP to be improved, I will consider this to be a great, great success. To start with, I want to start by clearing up some things, and it feels unusual. I actually have a lot of respect for the LARP community and for LARP organisers generally as being open-minded people who are open to feedback and are open to being challenged. So it feels a little unusual having to go through a stage where I become very precise about what we're talking about when we're discussing structural poverty, but I think it benefits all of us to be clear. Poverty definitely exists. There is wealth inequality in this world. The extent to which it impacts in your society and in your community may vary from country to country, but there is definitely a fact that there are people who live in poverty. It seems weird that I have to say this, but I have had this argument and I've had to convince people that poverty does exist. Secondly, individuals are not to blame for structural poverty. There is a political point of view that suggests that actually individuals are, but if you are of that opinion, then there is nothing I'm going to say in this talk that is going to be any use to you. No offense, it just is, just the way it is. This will go on the basis that individuals aren't to blame. It's not my fault personally that it takes me significantly longer to get to work in the morning. That's not a personal failing on my part. And that structural poverty is a byproduct of the economic system in which we live. And this is the part that is sometimes harder for people to accept. It's very pragmatic around here in this neighborhood. There are people that actually believe that it's a necessary byproduct of the society in which we live, that in order to have people who successfully run businesses, you need poor people to wait the tables. There are people around here who genuinely believe that. Personally, I don't. But this talk is supposed to be about pragmatics. This is supposed to be about how we can actually directly help people. And whether you feel that it is good or bad that this difference exists, doesn't change the fact that if you want people from backgrounds like ours here to attend your LARPs, you need to address it. And we can get into discussions about the pros and cons and the politics of it another time. This conversation is about how you get people from my background and the background of my neighbours and my peers to attend your blockbuster LARPs. So people are locked into poverty. And this is an important concept. Low-paid, unstable work environments create a situation in which it is extremely difficult to improve your situation. It's not just a case of pulling up your bootstraps. I'm very good, if you don't mind me saying, at pulling up my bootstraps, and in fact helping other people pull theirs up. It's much more difficult. And there are other barriers, other more obvious physical barriers, which we'll discuss later. But once you realize that people are locked into this state of poverty, then you need to accept that things such as rising living costs will suddenly have a dramatic impact on our ability to improve our situation. I can do an awful lot to create businesses, to create organizations, and then suddenly find myself back at the beginning because of a 25% increase in rates. This creates a daily struggle. And this daily struggle needs to be appreciated if you want to reach out to people from these backgrounds. This is something that has to be fought constantly. If you want to keep your head above water, you have to keep striving. You're always staying on top of the circumstances that are keeping you at the bottom of the social ladder. So what I've found that a lot of wealthy people do, and actually a reassuringly large number, I appreciate it doesn't feel like that sometimes, but I find it's reassuringly large, is that people do take steps to try to make it easier. Equality of opportunity is a big one, making sure that we all have an opportunity to play on the same playing field. But I make a note here in the slide that social mobility requires the freedom to move. Opening a door for me to allow me to attend your LARP is fantastic, as long as my starting position allows me to reach that door. And that is what I'm hoping we'll be able to discuss here, how we can help people get to the opportunities that you're creating for them. You're taking the time and the trouble to lower your ticket prices, to have discount tickets. What can we now do to help people get to the stage where they can buy those tickets in the first place? Some more basic realities. This one, obviously we did this talk in Zagreb, which was incredibly intimidating. Even though the facts of poverty are the same wherever you go, the actual circumstances feel massively different. But the level of solidarity I got from the people in Zagreb was extraordinary, and I still remember the warmth with which they cheered during this particular part. So we're going to quickly hammer through some basic facts about people from poor backgrounds. There is inconsistent quality of medical care. There is no guarantee that I'm going to get an accurate diagnosis, or even I'm going to get a diagnosis, because there are more people being served by less doctors. There is a high likelihood of depression, anxiety, and breakdown, both circumstantial and through birth. Poor sleep, limited control of the quality of food and of water. All of these things produce a situation where people from poor backgrounds have less health. They are just not as healthy. How does this affect your LARPs? It affects how likely it is that I'm going to be ill before your LARP runs. That's just a fact. I'm far more likely to catch something. I'm far more likely to not be able to move my doctor's appointment. Moving on, I've covered the legal conditions. This is actually a classic example. Very cramped living conditions, high background noise. We've changed rooms 3 times in the process of finding a place where we can live stream. Just the very fact that if you're ever in a position where you can say, yep, I know where I'm going to do my live stream from, and that's going to be consistently the same every time you go in there, that is a privilege that not everybody has. And I've got it good here. As we're discovering now, the actual levels of legal protection over things like rent agreements and work agreements, the work contracts, with limited access to solicitors and legal aid, it is very difficult for people to organise. And the impact of 21st century capitalism on unionisation has resulted in a lot of people not being in a position to negotiate anything with their landlords or with their employers. This becomes important later when we're discussing access to your LARPs and to holiday quite specifically. And a significantly high likelihood of being a victim of crime. I can pay in installments if I feel confident that I'm not going to be robbed some point between here and your LARP. But let's face it, there's a much higher chance that I won't have any money by the time I get to installment 2. Finally, the things that keep us locked into these circumstances is that not only do we not have a bank of mum and dad, I appreciate many people don't, but not only is that standard amongst people from these backgrounds, quite often we're the ones supporting our parents financially. We're the ones making sure they're okay. Routine activities are much more challenging. When I was teaching at South Bank and at Greenwich, I used to tell my students that if they came from poor backgrounds, they need to factor in the fact that it takes them longer and it takes more work for them to produce the equivalent amount of output. The university system isn't very good at accommodating that, so I found it very useful just to tell them to take that into account themselves. And we have a higher likelihood of having dependents of our own that we need to look after, vulnerable people and the like. So with a rough background of what kind of impact structural poverty can have on LARPers, we can start to talk about what kind of things stop them from being able to get to your LARP events, what makes it more difficult. And this came about as a result of talking to an awful lot of people from different LARP cultures across the world. I've managed to break it down into 3 rough categories: money, time, and responsibility. And this is, again, by no means definitive, but a starting point so that we can start looking at the many different ways in which poverty affects access to LARP. Start with money. Start with the big one. I'm not even sure these need going into, to be honest. They're all fairly self-explanatory. The actual ticket price itself. I want to emphasize this is not a criticism of how much people are charging for their tickets, and neither is it an attempt to condemn people who choose to pay people professionally in their LARP organizations. This is simply the reality of how much a ticket price is and whether or not we are then able to buy a ticket, not a judgment call on it. I found that people around here are quite forgiving of the idea of College of Wizardry costing several €100 for a ticket, but they're also realistic about the fact that they will never be able to pay for that. If you want to have people from backgrounds such as this come to College of Wizardry, then you need to look at other ways to deal with them. But the travel costs are enormous when it comes to getting to LARPs. We had, not just LARPs, actually conventions. We had a situation where we paid for tickets for some local creatives to get to some writing convention, only to discover that at no point did anyone put any effort into how they were going to get there, and not one of the attendees could afford the train fare to get to the conference. It's a fairly simple oversight to make. All of the ticket reductions in the world won't make up for it if you can't afford to get to the venue in the first place. And of course we have basic equipment costs. What is the barrier to entry in terms of how much does it cost to play your LARP? Do I need to buy expensive equipment? Do I need to spend money on costume? Do I need to do this to participate on an equal basis is another factor in it. It's not necessarily just that I need to do it. Even if you say it's only desirable, it's only optional, remember I want to participate on an equal basis with everybody else, and so do the people around here. If everybody is wearing reenactment grade costume, then I'm going to want to do the same thing. I'm not traveling halfway across the world just so I can be the pauper at somebody else's party. I will wear the appropriate equipment as well if I can afford it, or I just won't go. The other big barrier, because we spend a lot of time looking at money, the other big barrier, of course, is time. As discussed, with less ability to control and negotiate your contracts with your work, time flexibility just isn't there. It's just not to the same extent. Mandatory workshops become a very real barrier if you just can't get that extra day off because you don't have the luxury of choosing. Some LARPers have to gamble every single time they attend a LARP, and they're gambling that their work just simply isn't going to change their work roster at the last minute. And no one likes cancelling, but sometimes that is just not something that the LARPer themselves chooses. And I've known a number of situations where people have said to me that the reason why they pulled out of a LARP was because their work had suddenly told them they were no longer allowed to go. Then there is the hidden side of social capital. This one takes a little bit more thinking about. Social capital is a reality in LARP. It's a very real part of how we get invited to things and of how we interact with each other as a community. That requires a lot of socialization. That requires a lot of pub meets, a lot of visits, and a lot of visits to places that not everyone gets to go to. Making sure that that's not something that will necessarily stop someone from being part of your in-group could be a good way of starting to make sure that it's more accessible. I'm extremely lucky in that I have a lot of time flexibility, and I use that time flexibility to ensure that I'm at the social events that I need to be in order for my LARP team to not have to. Which actually ties in nicely to workplace flexibility. I set my own hours. It makes my life very easy. I'm aware of how extraordinarily privileged that is. Nobody else on my team gets to do that. Everybody else has very strict regulations in terms of where they have to be and when they have to be there. So this again affects whether or not you can get to LARPs, and also whether you can take advantage of last-minute offers. And the last-minute offers are crucial. And then I'll make a mention here of responsibilities. Now, these are not unique to people from structural poverty backgrounds, obviously, but what tools you have at your disposal to manage them can sometimes be affected. Family responsibilities, care, childminders, care facilities. If you're a full-time carer, certainly in the UK, and you're relying on the state to pay for your caring, you are not that much above people with disability living allowance, and it's not a great deal of money. It's a very difficult situation to find yourself in. But this is something that right now everyone is very sympathetic about, because suddenly all of these frontline workers have become the most important people in the world. So I imagine this is going to be a conversation we're all going to have pretty soon. And for structural poverty, let's not forget the importance of disabled accessibility. While we can continue to work and strive towards a situation in which workplaces provide equality of opportunity to people who are disabled, that's still some way off. And as a result, without the ability to throw money at problems, you find yourself, even with the ability to throw money at problems, those with disabilities still struggle to find full accessibility at LARPs. In fact, I'm uncomfortable even using the phrase full accessibility. It's just not a reality. But with no money to even throw extra support at that becomes significantly more challenging. And we need to make sure that that's accommodated. So, for those of you not following the slides at home, for the common strategies, tickets and travel, I've introduced the common sight of the budget Larper, the Ryanair flight late at night when nobody else has bought any tickets because no one wants to take the risk that this flight just simply isn't actually going to be taking off. Uh, discount tickets, well, we'll cover that under travel. So discount tickets. Discount tickets are fantastic. Let's be clear. They're having a couple of concessionary tickets is a great move. And I am in no way criticizing this. I want to encourage it and encourage people to keep it up. This is really useful stuff. But it doesn't work for everybody. And it's not a panacea. It's not something that's going to solve all of your accessibility problems. The difference between 225 and 175 euros makes very little difference for many of the people that I'm talking about. Installment plans are extraordinarily controversial. The last time installment plans was brought up, it led to an argument, it raging in my inbox. I can understand both positions on this. It's there are two very, very legitimate polarized views. One is that it allows you to break it down into digestible chunks, and the other one is obviously if I can't guarantee I can pay for the whole ticket, I'm not going to put myself in debt. And I think that's an argument that bears a bit more thinking. That whether you agree with it or not is actually irrelevant because it's the person who is taking up the installment plan. That's the person we're trying to help, right? So actually it's their views. A lot of people, I'm very reluctant to use credit or overdrafts or any kind of loan agreement purely because I can't guarantee I'm not going to lose absolutely everything next month. And I don't want to be left in a position where I owe a LARP organizer 300 euros. That's just not something I want on my conscience. So I will save 300 euros if necessary, because then if it turns out that I do get robbed, I've got no one who I've hurt except myself. I don't need to drag other people into my misery. So that's the controversy about installment plans. That's going to be a discussion that's going to be had. I'm hoping we'll be able to find some kind of solution, but it may well be that just becomes something that people either use or don't use. As long as it's not the only thing, I think that's what counts. Last minute stand-in tickets, the bastion of the poor international LARPer. Now, obviously, there is an entirely understandable amount of is pressure the right word? There's an understandable amount of encouragement for people to pay for last-minute stand-in tickets if they can. But last-minute stand-in tickets are invaluable to people who can't afford to go to international LARPs any other way. And filling up that space in your LARP, quite often, those LARPers will then make up for the fact that they can't afford to pay for the ticket with a little bit more enthusiasm. After all, you have to be flexible. You don't know what you're going to be cast as. So you make sure that you get really good at playing whatever it is that you are given. And I've found that a lot of people who do this are very grateful for the roles they get. My personal favourite historically has always been LARP credits and staff tickets. This allows the combination, it allows me to keep my pride. It allows me to feel like I am contributing to the LARP community, while at the same time still being able to play and engage with the LARP fully. I've met an awful lot of very, very good friends while building sets for your much loved LARPs, and I would not have it any other way. I can understand the discussion about exploitation of physical labor. I can understand that and I appreciate that, but at the same time I also appreciate being able to attend LARPs and seeing you all. So be very careful not to stop me from being able to attend the LARP because you don't want me to be exploited. How we find a balance that everyone is comfortable with, that's a conversation we have. I'm assuming personally that conversation starts with respect, that we have respect for the people who build the LARPs, when we should be doing this anyway. But if we know that there are people who the only reason they're able to engage with this LARP is because they took time out to help make it happen in the first place, then we should perhaps be respectful of that. Some of the biggest savings that I've ever had in Larp have come from savings on travel, just flat out. Booking in advance any kind of travel arrangements, but mostly non-peak travel, traveling at the weird times, looking at the timetables to see whether or not I can still get back to Finsbury Park from Gatwick at midnight is a fairly common exercise, because that can be the difference between 180 euros and 20 euros for a flight. And that's huge. That's a deal breaker for many larps. Also, I travel very, very light. And the other thing I've noticed with the other people who do this is the sheer skill that goes into putting everything you need to attend a LARP into one small bag and sharing resources. After all, Ryanair's going to charge you €60 for each extra piece of luggage. You're going to make sure that you need that luggage before you're dragging it on with you on that plane, especially if you're trying to get onto that plane at last minute at midnight. So no, you get everything that you can carry and you put it in a small bag, and if you can at all get away with it, you get as much as you can at the other end. So then catering. How do I make sure I can eat at your LARPs? Fortunately, most of you provide food, and that's really good. For those of you that don't, well, we'll make sure that I get my food elsewhere, buying it from a supermarket, buying it from wherever it is that local people buy their food from. I'll try to become an expert on those locations and make sure that I've got my own supplies purchased from the other end. Making sure that I have time and space to eat that would be nice. And I can understand everyone wants it all to be communal, but it's only communal if we all get to participate. And I would honestly love to be able to drop the amount of money some people drop on their food, but I just can't do that. So I will make do with the stuff that I've bought from the supermarket, particularly when it comes to alcohol as well. So continuing with the strategies that we've seen and we've collected from people that have spoken to us about what they do. I love event provided equipment. Costume hire works for me, especially if it's significantly cheaper than the cost of carrying the stuff or putting it into luggage and sourcing it myself. Any kind of supplied costumes can actually be really helpful. Now, this creates problems from an organizational point of view. I'm aware of this. At this stage, I'm not actually looking for solutions. I'm not coming here saying this is how you should run your organization. I'm literally just here saying this is what helps me and people like me. Costume hire helps. But then again, LARPs that have minimal costume requirements, we have, when discussing this, I've spoken to a lot of people who just said they flat out avoid LARPs that have specific costume requirements. So there's that. If you've got no costume requirements at all, that's going to lower the bar in terms of how accessible it's going to be for people from backgrounds of structural poverty. But if I absolutely must provide my own gear, then you are going to see me at every single discount sale that you have ever seen. I will buy everyone's surplus LARP kit, especially if they're no longer LARPing and they need a place to store all of that stuff, or they always want to get rid of it to get it out of their house. And of course, there is making your own. Borrowing and kit swaps can be a touchy subject with some people, and I want to explain why that's a touchy subject, if that's okay. This goes back to the idea that I'm not in a position to replace it if I break it. So if I borrow your glass decanter, I'm not in a position to buy you a new one. And so it's not being rude. It's just that if I can't replace it, I'm not going to run the risk of being in a situation where you don't invite me back because I smash your stuff up and I do nothing to repair that. So this makes me nervous about borrowing your things. Hire, for some reason, that's fine. If I'm hiring stuff, then we've entered into a pre-negotiated agreement. Borrowing it based on goodwill, unless I can absolutely guarantee that you will have that back in the exact same condition you gave it to me, I'm going to make sure that your kindness is not punished, and that will mean quite often turning you down. So common strategies for event organization for Larpers who are poor, who put on events. There are locations that you tend to see more often used by LARP organisers who themselves are poor. I've thrown in the remote locations because it's factually true. I know several poor LARP organisers who exclusively run their LARPs in really hard to get hold of locations. But you will see a prevalence of youth centres and community centres. Some of them are really good. The picture, for those of you following the slides, is of several very good location. I'll put up a link at a later date. But it's a very good LARP venue. As you can see, it looks very pretty, it looks wonderful, and is very reasonably priced. See if that changes if everyone tries to book it. But of course, there are compromises that then need to be made. Everybody in LARP hoards. I'm going to just jump onto the scenography section. Everybody in LARP hoards like you wouldn't believe. But when you've got no guarantee that you'll be able to replace anything, you will reuse everything, like the most extraordinary amount of reuse of props and equipment that takes place. I'll make a note of it here, this make, do and mend culture, that we don't buy it unless we can absolutely guarantee that we can't use something we already have. But in the main, when it comes to scenography and props, the common trend I've found amongst the people that I've spoken to is that poor LARP organisers take advantage of a wonderful level of community support. I've been organising LARPs for a long time now, and if you ever wondered why I love this community so much, it's because I remember every single time a much wealthier organiser has just freely given us things that they thought would be really cool at our LARP. And that kind of stuff remains. You don't forget that in a hurry, even if they don't know the circumstances that we were running our LARPs from. It mattered to us. It was important. And so we were very appreciative of it. So I will always make a mention of community support. If you're a poor organizer out there and you're looking at this thinking, hey, I've got no money, how do I put on LARPs for myself? This community will back you up. They are extremely kind as a rule. But on the other hand, they also need to know that you need help. Just putting that out there. Poor organizations stay in the black. I think as a LARP organizer, I've run into a debt once. And it took me 3 years to recover from that debt. That's a hard lesson to learn, but you have no choice. So every LARP you run runs at some degree of profit because there's no other option. There is no credit card. There is no backup plan. You've got no other money to fall back on. So of course your LARP's going to end up with more money at the end of it than what you went in. Otherwise, well, you don't have any yourself. The rest of it goes on pizza. Finding cheap hosting isn't that difficult, but again, finding community support. A number of people who work together to pool their resources to establish a web presence. There's a lot of very cheap and accessible ways of putting your website up online. But reaching out and getting advice and help. These strategies are used by a lot of LARP organisers. And one of the best things about the LARP community is that the main marketing avenue is free. We spread it amongst each other like wildfire. The main criteria, and this is a great equalizing factor actually. Sorry for those of you who are hoping I was just going to demonize you for like an hour. No, one of the great things is that the word of mouth, it seems to purely come down to the quality of product. Cool ideas will be rewarded by members of the community talking about them. The trick is making sure that we are forgiving of those who are putting in the effort. So what can we actually do? Apparently you can't just spend an hour telling people that there's a problem and this is what we do to survive. Apparently you do actually need to give people some kind of hope that there's an angle. But I think the first thing we need to accept is that right now as a community we don't actually have an answer. And that's okay. It's okay for us to say, we don't have a definitive answer right now. We've just started the discussion properly. There's already been a lot of earnest efforts out there. And this presentation, this talk exists because of a discussion about the role of structural poverty and about widening the net of who can engage in LARPs. So things are positive. But immediately, just based on what I've seen, I've put together some thoughts as to where we can go from here. We need to support the existing strategies that are used by people from poor backgrounds to attend LARPs. So how can we do this? If it is cheaper for me to attend a LARP a day or 2 days earlier, then any support that you can give me as an organizer to hook me up with a sofa I can stay on, as long as it's done in a safe fashion, and the safety is vital, as long as it's done in a safe fashion, then that would be gold dust. That would be worth so much more. I've been in a position where I've had to weigh up, am I going to spend more on the ticket price or am I going to spend it on a cheap hotel? And frankly, there have been times I've been in some of those very cheap hotels and I thought I would literally be safer in any LARPer's house than in the motel I found myself in or the hostel I found myself in. And I'm not alone in that by a long, long stretch. Help with transport from airports during antisocial hours. If I'm turning up at Gatwick at 1 a.m, I want to see as an organizer if there's anything I can do to help that person get to a safe location. Because they're not doing that because they've looked at the options and have chosen that's the most comfortable way to visit my country. They're doing that because they have to. And if they're going to go through the trouble of traveling to Gatwick to come to one of my LARPs, then I like to think I will try at least to get them somewhere comfortable. And taking a very careful look at what sort of resources are nearby. What sort of resources are nearby to the LARP venue that are going to be useful to people who are traveling on a very restricted budget? It's much easier. I've had to learn how to say budget store in like 5 different languages. It's not impossible, but it would be certainly so much easier if somebody who's local could tell me where I need to go to get these things. The next thing that we can do is make sure that we don't add to the burden. That's something we can do immediately right now. If we have people from poor backgrounds attending our LARPs, let's not make it more difficult. Surprise costs is the big killer. I can budget for a LARP if in your practical section it tells me everything I need to know about how much it's going to cost, and it tells me how much time I need to, even without any of the other assistance. If you just accurately give me the information in the first place, I can make a plan. But everything that changes is cutting into a reserve that I simply don't have. And again, I'm using me as just the example figure here. These are the numerous people I've spoken to. Some of the stories, you'll have heard them yourselves. They about the extra costs that have appeared, and suddenly the Larpers try to work out how exactly they're going to be getting home. This is the sort of thing we need to make sure doesn't happen. If we can allow flexibility, if we can try to figure that into our organisation, that will help a great deal. If we have a Larper who says, look, I just can't get that Thursday off, is it possible for me to spend all night studying your workshop? I appreciate as much as anybody else that you want everybody to be in attendance for every single workshop, but that's just not always going to be possible. And that will be part of the accommodation, is making sure that people have some flexibility so that they can make plans that work for their budget. And respecting the difficulties. I think this is what we're starting to do really well. We can obviously do more, but the very fact that we're even having this conversation is a huge start. Once we can respect that the difficulties are being faced, then we can actually start resolving them. Information should be upfront and accurate, I've written here. Providing extra support when circumstances change, and helping with the strategies they use to save money. All of these now hopefully seem quite common sense and really quite straightforward. But these are things that will make a difference. So why? Why do it at all? There are many, many different ways to approach narratives. If we're going to continue to use the same cross-section of society to tell stories, then we're going to keep hearing the same tales over and over again. From a brutally pragmatic point of view, having a more diverse audience, having a more diverse participant base, and having more diverse organisers, well, that will result in a greater and richer community of narratives and stories. I want the local writers in this neighbourhood to be able to attend your LARPs, and more importantly, I want them to become writers for your LARPs, which is something they're not really going to be able to do until they've at least done a couple of blockbusters. Once we have that variety, I believe that we will all benefit greatly from this. Play for all isn't just an idealistic concept that we should do because it's morally right. Don't get me wrong, it is morally right, and we should do it because it's morally right. But on top of that, we all benefit as a result of doing this. That's it. We no longer have to talk hypothetically about, I wonder what it's like to have a story about gang activities in inner city estates. We're going to have interesting discussions, by the way, on the back of this, because some of the stories you'd think we want to talk about around here, we really don't want to talk about. We are far more interested in your optimism. Hope Punk is going to be huge. But play for all. Play for all is something that is worth doing as a goal in and of itself. And if we can make it possible so that people with less money can access the LARPs, then we can start trying to do more to increase the diversity in terms of the ethnicity of participants. After all, as long as structural poverty is intrinsically tied in with institutional racism, these two things are going to go hand in hand. And this is things that we need to address. Thank you. I'm deeply humbled that you actually even wanted to hear this. Put up a page of a number of useful resources. I particularly love the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. Social Metrics Commission, obviously incredibly useful. Disability Voice Islington, wish they were watching, but yeah, unfortunately extremely busy right now. Trussell Trust and Child Poverty Action Group are both some of the most important people working towards combating poverty in the UK right now. Voluntary Action Islington is a partner of my own organisation and the Mental Health Foundation. In addition, I should also name shout out to Area 51, Centre 404 and a whole bunch of other places that you've never heard of, but just because I love the work they do with autism and with disability access. And finally, larpfund.org. The work you do is amazing, and I can't say enough good things about you. So thank you all very, very much for your time, and I hope this leads to a compassionate, proactive, and productive dialogue in terms of what we can do to increase accessibility to LARP to everybody, regardless of their social background. Thank you. I guess questions. Does anyone actually have any questions? That was such an emphatic nod.
What are your thoughts on how tight, resilient communities can steer the hobbies of the members?
Oh, wow. Tight, resilient.
Question from Karen.
How tight, resilient community. Now, we are living in the very definition of a tight, resilient community here. It's how they can steer the hobbies of the participants. Okay, so this actually is, wow, this is a question that requires like a whole topic in and of itself. Yes, positive engagement with any given activity, particularly if you can penetrate that community at all, then any level of engagement is going to be seen as a positive step. There are not many activities around here, for instance, that are seen as being for people around here. Like I remember being told explicitly that role-playing games weren't for me, and I'd like to think that's clearly not the case. But yes, I think it can make a huge difference. And I'm very happy to have that conversation again, incidentally.
If participants were given the opportunity to quietly receive the, as per your last example, reenactment grade costumes their size as gifts or loans, would that be helpful or just insulting?
So the key thing is clarity. Would it be seen as insulting? Well, first of all, some will. But we just need to accept the fact that we have to keep going back to there is no one size fits all. But what we should try to do is encourage an environment where we are not punishing people for making decisions like that one way or another. We can try to create a narrative where it's being done in a thoughtful way, and that it's for people for whom that works. And the moment you've engaged with that level of support in a thoughtful way, you've stopped it from being insulting. You're not assuming that everybody needs this. You're just saying that if someone needs this, this is a service that's available, and that's very different. If I've got time, I'd like to very quickly explain why. I'll very quickly explain why, and that is because it is not necessarily true that somebody from a background of structural poverty is themselves not important locally, or that they are not a pillar of the community, or that they're not famous. There are a lot of extremely successful people who are broke, because that's the way our society functions. And again, we can all talk about how wrong that is, but that is just the way it is. Thank you very much. I think that's us done. Enjoy the rest of SK, and it's been wonderful talking to you all. We'll take care.